Hey everybody, and welcome to this last episode of this interactive lecture series. So far, I introduced you to the principles and the different techniques and tools for perspective drawing of products. And I would like to show you now how you could mix and apply them in a very efficient workflow. For example, by trying to rebuild this toaster. And when we're done with the toaster, you will actually see that really your building blocks are your proportional square, your proportional cube, and your circular ellipse, and your vanishing points, of course. And when you master those few elements, whatever you need to draw might be a question of time and precision. You need to invest. A simple object can be drawn quicker, like a hairdryer. A more elaborate object like a car might take more time, but in terms of difficulty, or they're pretty much on the same level actually. It's just the amount of details. So what you see here is a computer screenshot from that model, and I translated this one actually into a 2-point perspective drawing. So here you can see is my proportional cube, and with this cube established, I created my bounding box that includes, for example, the toaster, and here I have few additional vanishing lines. So I roughly have an understanding to where my original vanishing points actually are. And during last class lecture, I made a point that when you don't really know what you want to draw, starting directly in 3D could be a difficult thing. It's always good, specifically when you are new to perspective drawing, to make yourself some profile studies. So that's, for example, what I have here. So you see, let me zoom in a little bit. Here you see some screenshots, which I took from my computer model. A front view, side view, a top view, and actually another top view that's rotated. So why is this actually really important or useful? So for example, pay attention to this. If you follow those white lines, you will actually see that they all relate to the same element in different drawings. For example, those two lines follow also to this button, and this cube goes over to this cube. So for example, in this image, I see in the front where this button is. Here I see from a side where this button is in terms of height. Here I see it more where it's positioned left and right. So those profile studies are actually really helpful when you can create those to get a good idea about how your object should look like. Because the problem again is when you start sketching in perspective, you have to work with foreshortening. So everything that's closer to you will become bigger. Everything that goes away from you will get smaller. So it's kind of tricky to really estimate this foreshortening when you're new to drawing. And starting like with a sketch layout like this can really be very helpful. Now on some other layers, for example here. Let's start with this one first. I have, for example, selected my proportional cube, here represented by a square. And then as you can see, I started subdividing the proportional square into smaller proportional squares. In this way, I created a grid layout, which helps me, for example, to figure out where elements of my profile studies in the background relate to this white grid. For example, we can easily see that this part for example, of the opening somewhat is exactly at the center. And you see that this line is close to the midline of my cube. And for example, this vertical line is a little bit to the center, but very close to this midline of the smaller cube. Similar to the cube for the button, is a little bit smaller than this proportional square. So you can see like where this midpoint here is and where this vertical midline is. So we can use those actually as a reference to judge a little bit where we have to draw these lines. Now again, perspective drawing is not necessarily about being 100% accurate, because that's insanely difficult, but it's about communicating nice proportions. And as long as the error tolerance is in an acceptable area, you're actually really fine. So what, for example, can I do with this one? Let's maybe take a look at those other two. So for example, here you see from a top view, I did exactly the same. With this line, for example, I noticed that this is actually very close to where the metal part for the toaster inserts actually stops. I also see that this gray line is a little bit to the midpoint. So for example, if I draw a line here and draft a line down, there you can see it looks like, I don't know, 1/3 or something, a little bit more than a quarter. And I also see here that, for example, the way how this button pushes in a little bit seems to be a little bit more than half of the smaller cube. So those two-dimensional studies, because I work here with squares and verticals and diagonals, I can easily transfer those also into 3D space. So for example, let me turn those on. Let's start maybe with the front one. Yeah. So, and let me turn those off. So, perfect. So there, for example, now you can see and easily compare how I transferred the white grid line on the right side into perspectively correctly foreshortened red lines in 2-point perspective on the left side. This way, for example, I easily see now where's this vertical line that's here, the second vertical line I can sketch in. I didn't put it in, so those drawings don't get too dense. But I assume that now you can pretty much get a good feeling for where this line, for example, here has to be, where this black horizontal bar has to be. So that's actually very helpful. Let's go maybe one step further. Let's take a look at the top part. So there you see that once, for example, I figured out the front part, I also have the midline. I can construct this midline up. I can use the proportional cube far left edge to draft the line up till it hits my boundary box into which I put my toaster into. Then I find the midline, the far left line on top. And then the same method, trying step by step, subdividing that space, started to help me generating a nice look and kind of like a spatial subdivision, which then I can use to place my different elements. For example, again, I know that this black line here is following exactly this line. So in my drawing here in perspective, it has to be this line. This black line is following this white line here, so that is actually this line. Then I just need to figure out the left and right, and I have to move it a little bit upwards, which means this line, if I'm going to create it, it has to go a little bit towards me. And if I show the other drawing, for example, from a side, try to figure out the height of this opening, where maybe this opening starts. And you see that instead of using my proportional cube or square, I simply use the size of my boundary box for my toaster. Because all I want to do is just figure out how can I subdivide the space. I also wanted to find from a side the perfect midpoint. From the front or the top, you see that the proportional square is actually equal to the width. Here, as you can see with the black line, the proportional square sits inside my toaster. So I can't really use the proportional square in this case to find the midpoint. This one here where my mouse is. So there I needed to use the bigger boundary box. And that's basically what I have here. And there you can see that this line roughly defines closely the upper edge. I have this line here. For example, this vertical line stops somewhere in between here, so 2 cubes away after the mid part. So for example, 1 cube, 2nd cube, so we'll start somewhere here probably. Okay, so I hope you understand that actually with this second step, so before I start even sketching into it, I just map out my space and create really nice profiles so that when I have to construct stuff, it won't be very confusing or difficult to work with. Now, before I go into showing you the next step, I would like to take a moment to address one problem. You don't necessarily see it here right now, but for example, this top face is very easy to see. The cube is more below. I can comfortably see it. When, for example, you have a problem of this top face being very narrow, it's going to be difficult to sketch on it. But what I do up here, I can also do, for example, down here. So there I can create, for example, the same drawing. And hold on 1 second, let me hide this one, because then I'm going to continue exactly doing the same here, there. And for example, I'm going to continue this cube. So you see, for example, that I have exactly the same reference points. So if, for example, I have, I know, maybe, let's say I have this line and I would like to find it, I can easily, because this is bigger, judge how far this line has to be away. So then I can draft up, find this midpoint from here, draft my line up, find this midpoint, and then I can connect these two lines. And then I have exactly this line drawn with a slight movement more to the right vanishing point, because you can see that this distance and this distance are actually really easily looking very different. But in this view, because it's perspective or shortening, it starts to change or feel different. And it can sometimes be confusing to your eye. So whenever one face is difficult to work with, it's not really a big deal. We can just maybe use a familiar, not a familiar, like an opposite face. Because again, the whole concept is that I'm using my bigger box kind of like as a guide. And what I mean with that is, so from here, let me draw a vanishing line to maybe there. Let me adjust this so it's a little bit cleaner. Okay. So this line comes from the vanishing point, goes through the midpoint, cuts this line here. Then I can draw a line up. Now I have this midpoint, and from there, for example, I can go back and there. And what you see here is actually a small, again, a construction plane that's inside my space. So I use this bigger box to, for example, to draw on the outside, so I can project parts inside. And for example, if I now say here and here, see then this way, I can construct it simply another plane that's kind of like positioned inside my cube. Okay, so I hope this was quite informative. And in the next step, I'm going then to show you how, for example, I would approach constructing this cutout for the level.